This is MS Office Hours. Today is November the 21st, 2019, and we have with us Mr. Chris Irwin from Foresight IT Solutions, who's going to talk to us today a little bit about Azure Active Directory B2B and external guest access in your Office 365 and Azure environments.
Thank you, Preston. This is either going to work out really, really well, or it's going to be a horrible disaster. I've got my Surface pulled up. I'm using 2 team sessions today, and we're going to try and whiteboard this. So I've done this in the past, and it's worked pretty well, but we'll give it a shot. So let me know when you see my screen, Preston.
We see your screen.
Awesome. All right. All right, we're going to talk about guest access in Office 365. For those of you that don't know, guest access B2B is phenomenal, and you should know about it. So we're going to talk about it today. Really, let's go ahead, and if this lags any, guys, please tell me, and I'll try and slow down. As it stands today, you've typically got the cloud out here, and excuse my horrible drawing, but I thought this was better than the deck.
I like whiteboarding. So does everybody else. You'd rather not stare at slides.
There you go. We've got Azure AD out here. We've got our on-prem AD. We've got, let's call this AADC. And then we've got our little guy on-prem. Stick people are awesome. All right, so this is typically what you have in place today, right? We've got Active Directory accounts that get created, they get synchronized up into Azure, and then you light up services based off of that, whether that's Office 365 or other SaaS applications. Google, and that's supposed to be an O, not an I. This could be Box, any number of things, right? I did not go to art school, by the way. You can also light up, for those of you that aren't familiar, Azure App Proxy. So we can, through this federation, if an individual in your organization is trying to access on-prem web applications, they could potentially use Azure App Proxy to access. And so all of that runs through based on your on-premise Active Directory account and the connection into Azure Active Directory. If you were going to enable, an external entity, maybe you've got another school, you've got someone in a consortium, you're a medical university, and you've got accounts that, with other organizations that you federate with, what you would typically do is bring in their users into your Active Directory, and that would again get synchronized up, and we create the shadow copy up here, and you would be able to give them access. The downside to this is that you've got to manage the identity lifecycle for this user. Now you've got to handle password resets, you've got to handle name changes if anything happens. Anything along with the life cycle of that account is your responsibility. It is on you to manage. In most cases, these are users that you have very little knowledge of. Maybe they've left the organization. This account could sit here for months before you're ever aware of it. And they've got access to these various tools, potentially. It could be Azure applications. It could be data in your environment. Basically, anything that you can give a standard user access to, these guys have access to now. A lot of disadvantages to this. This is the bane of a lot of people's existence. We've even looked at this for parent accounts. Right now you're having to go through and manage all those, and it's a giant hassle. So what B2B accounts allow you to do is get rid of this giant pain. So we're going to remove all of this here, and through the magic of Azure in the cloud, you can go ahead and create B2B objects. What that does is tie the authentication and identity management back to an external provider. So that can be another Office 365 or Azure AD environment. That can be Google. That could be a Microsoft account. It could be an external email address. There's a function or feature now called one-time password, where it essentially does an email one-time code to an email. So this could be, somebody's home email account, AOL, whatever. Virtually anything now can be lit up through a guest account. And the beauty of this is it offloads the authentication for these users now. That happens in their directory. So if I'm logging into contoso.com with a Fabricam account, this is fab.com, and we'll call this Contoso. Now I can access resources in any of these provided services using my fabricam.com address. I don't have to have a second identity. I maintain the same username and password that I would in Fabricam, and that allows me to access anything in Contoso. Phenomenal process. When this account goes away, when they can no longer authenticate over here, all of a sudden this link gets broken and this account doesn't have access to anything any longer. Really makes it easier, removes the burden of identity management off of you. Password self-service, everything else takes place externally on the right side of the line now. The beauty of this, because it's going through Azure Active Directory, anything that authenticates through Azure AD in these accounts, you can put conditional access on, you can put multi-factor auth on, just like you would your standard user accounts. So these accounts have the ability to be given access to Teams channels, to be given access to Azure resources, given access to on-prem applications through Azure App Proxy, SaaS applications, etc., while not burdening you with the identity management of it. I do want to point out there is one exception with the B2B accounts. If you want to allow them access to on-premise applications via Azure App Proxy, you have to create an on-prem identity for them that has the same UPN, that has that on Microsoft UPN. And with that, because Azure App Proxy uses a Kerberos constrained delegation, it requires that on-prem identity. But those can be linked together, and that is just an extra step that you have to go through to make that happen. Now, do we have any questions? I'm going to show you the interface, what it looks like, how you invite people. Do we have any questions around why we may want to use Azure B2B accounts or how it functions at a high level? Nothing?
I think this is great. Did everybody understand the app proxy and how that functions? I think that's kind of an important component.
I've got a whole slide deck on that, by the way.
This is
we didn't have enough time to cover it all, though.
I did have one question. This is Rob Schmidt. Are these users considered external users? I've seen that in documentation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's
excellent.
actually what I was going to show you. We're going to switch over. I'm going to stop sharing on my tablet and switch over to my desktop, and I'll show you. They show up as external users. You can apply filters to them. You can put policies based on that delineation. You can create dynamic groups and have things, applied to them. They'll show up as guest users in some places, and the authentication will show up as external in other places. Does that answer your question, Rob?
It did. Thank you very much.
Even on B2B user accounts, can't you you can update that attribute against that user so that they're not listed as a guest?
Absolutely. Yes, you can. So, and you can do that. It's just an attribute, and it's called group type. So you can update that with PowerShell. You can update it with Azure AD Connect. Any, the graph, any tool that allows you to manipulate Azure accounts, you can update that with.
Yeah, I call that out because it's interesting. You can have on-prem AD accounts and still tag those as guests if you're using policies to restrict guest access.
Yes, and actually, so let me show you. This is a demo tenant I've got. I've got this filtered down, so let me just start over here. We're in my Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go under users here. Right now, it's showing everyone, and you can see the icon shows up a little different for them. But I'm going to change it to guest users only right now. And what that's going to light up here is these are users of type guest. We can see the source, so where are they coming from? It creates an invitation process, and these objects actually get stubbed out in your directory until they're logged into. When they log in, it'll change, the source will change from an invited user to an external Azure Active Directory or something else, depending on what the source is.
Now, if you invite a guest to a team that is not part of your B2B, will they show up in this list also?
Yes, it creates a guest account for them. So that's one of
Okay.
the ways you can, in Teams, you can define what they can create accounts for or not. My biggest complaint about guest accounts is the invitation process, and not invitation necessarily, but creation. I can do one-off user creation. It's really easy, you know, and this is great for adding one person to a team or something along those lines. I can do, you know, bulk creation of guest users, but it requires a CSV file, and it's kind of a hassle. Right now, there's no native way to bring in folks in mass. And Dave mentioned the state system that we're working with. You know, that's one of the challenges. We're trying to consolidate gals and provide access to some consolidated or shared services, and it's a real hassle to maintain that. So one of the things we did was put together a little service around it that lives out in the cloud, and you essentially, you know, give it a couple of data sources and create a sync rule, and it basically goes through and does that mapping for you based on a group membership. And that's what we see here. The accounts that are created are actually all sourced from my primary tenant, and we used our Cloud Connect tool to create them. It does deltas and you know, updates and that type of stuff. But I think that's the power of B2B accounts. Now, you know, you can do consolidated tenant, and that makes sense in a lot of scenarios, but there are cases where you break those tenants apart, or you've got external partnerships, you're in a consortium, and you still need to be able to share resources and collaborate. You know, guest accounts provide you that ability where you can get rich collaboration. You can bring them in as member of teams. You can give them access to resources in your environment, even on-premise applications, without actually having to create and manage identities for them. A really, really cool feature. We've got a lot of folks starting to take advantage of this and get very creative in how they're utilizing it.
Yeah, I really like what you were showing. If you want to talk a little bit more about how you guys are putting that together, because you mentioned the new preview that's over here for CSV invites you have showing, but there's a limitation there that it only does the UPN. It doesn't actually bring in display name either. So it's very
so
big.
What we ended up doing, there's a whole host of graph APIs available to you. You know, we were looking at this as a way to, the whole premise initially, Preston, started out as gal synchronization. We wanted to create contacts. And then we did that, and we said, hey, B2B accounts would be even better because you can assign them resources. And the cool thing about the B2B accounts is, if you're working with a school that's got Google or what have you, that's completely fine and 100% valid. It's not limited to Azure Active Directory. So we made it really simple. You know, you create a data source and put in an app ID, so you register an application and give it some rights, and then you simply create a sync rule for it, and it just sits there and runs in the background and makes sure these guys get updated. You know, you give it a source tenant and a destination. It pulls in the groups from the source tenant, so you can scope who's going to get replicated. Maybe I only want a small subset of people. I can pick that group, whether a contact or B2B. It'll even create, if you've got the agent configured, the on-prem account for you so that you can do app proxy natively without having to do anything special. Show them in the gal, you know, create display names and do some basic configs on that. You know, all that kind of stuff. And it just makes it really easy, because this is great functionality, but the biggest inhibitor we've run into is just the creation and management. And by using a tool like this, it makes it super simple. It just sits there and pulls that partnership entity on a regular basis, checks that membership, so as they add people or remove them, it manages those users in your environment, and you don't ever have to think about it. And then we couple that together with dynamic groups. You know, we can use any of these attributes and create dynamic groups off of it and provide resource level access, application level access based off of that without ever having to touch the system after the initial setup. It's really, really powerful stuff. We see a lot of folks starting to take advantage of it. And in certain instances, they avoid a tenant consolidation where they only need one thing, or if you've got a new partnership or consortium, that's one of the things we're looking at in the consortium. They want to have a shared gal. And this gives me an easy way to do that using B2B accounts or even contacts in that scenario.
This is a good one. I didn't even know you were going to talk about this today, so I'm super excited about it. One of the challenges I know I see a lot with folks that are even in this community is where they're part of a university system, a large university system, and they would like to essentially, for lack of a better term, do a full federation between their tenants so that everybody shows up in the people picker. They're already automatically invited, if you will. And I think this is an interesting way to accomplish it today using the existing Graph API.
Yeah, we use the Graph API. We build it off of B2B accounts, and that's exactly the scenario, right? They need to be able to have some level of access, but you don't want to have to be stuck managing accounts for every school or for every person in the system. And so, since we can tie it back to their tenant, you don't have to do that, right? Their IT department goes through their normal life cycle, and when users fall out, they simply get removed and authentication quits working. And what I really find, Preston, is interesting is, not everyone is running Azure AD, so this is not Azure AD specific. We can tie back into Google or flat files or what have you, although the flat files aren't ideal. We want a cloud directory if possible, but it opens up the ability for you to collaborate, whether they're on a Microsoft platform or a Google platform.
It's interesting. I'd like to at some point just personally rip a little more on how this might tie into some of the announcements around entitlement management and some of that, right? If the users exist in the directory, then delegating access control throughout your organization is more realistic.
It's very realistic, and one of the things we've started to take advantage of is the attestation components, right? They're just user accounts at that point. So you can go through and you can create access reviews on them, and if you've got a cross university group going on, maybe you're working on a project, you can put someone in charge and have access reviews and attestation around it and the whole 9 yards without having to manage the identity. It just happens in the background. The person that's participating uses their normal ID, and it just simplifies everything for people across the board. A lot of possibilities, really, really cool technology, and we've seen a ton of people interested in it. It's all based off of B2B. If you're wondering, you get a 5-to-1 ratio on your B2B account. So for every paid account, you get 5 B2B accounts that you can extend the same rights to, whether that's MFA or what have you. So it really lets you extend that out and take advantage of the services that you're already paying for, when you're allowing guest access into your environment.
Yeah, and John had asked a question about that. So to that point, Azure AD B2B does not require premium at all. If you have Azure AD Basic Education, you can do B2B accounts. It's the advanced feature sets like MFA, conditional access controls, that you find in premium plan 1 and 2. And that's specifically what Chris was talking about, as far as you can use those conditional access and MFA capabilities for your guest accounts at a 5-to-1 ratio. Sorry, I just had to clarify that. Thanks.
No, awesome. I didn't even see it, so I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, that's one of the first things folks ask about. I go, hey, this looks great, but how do we license it? And in most cases, you already own it. It's there. You just need to take advantage of it.
Yeah, this is really cool. And for the tool you were showing is not a Microsoft tool, that type of thing. So I do want to make sure before you get off here, people know how to contact you if this is something.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, and I guess I should have brought that up. This is Foresight created content based on some work we were doing with other schools. If anyone's interested, we'd be happy to set you up with a trial, and you can kick the tires on it. You can reach out to me. My email is chris.irwin@ForesightIT, and I'll put that in the chat in just a second. Dave and Preston know me. I see them pretty regularly. So more than happy. We do a ton of stuff around identity and B2B, and I think it's a really exciting technology. It's interesting to see how schools are taking advantage of it.
Yeah, this is really cool. Anything
Awesome.
else that you wanted to cover off on?
I think that's the the bulk of B2B, I mean, it's a really simple concept. And I think the thing to stress is that you can do virtually anything with a B2B account that you can do with a normal account. There are a few minor exceptions, but by and large, if you can give a normal user access to it, you can give a B2B account access. And I think one thing a lot of folks miss out on is the Azure App Proxy and exposing those on-premise applications. Even if you're not using B2B, that's a really cool technology. If your web application authenticates to Active Directory, we can expose that through Azure App Proxy, and then you can take advantage of all the goodness that's built into Azure AD, like conditional access, MFA, even if your app's not aware of it. And being able to extend that to external parties is an even bigger bonus.
Yeah, hey, I got to make this point, right? Azure or the remote app proxy is also available to everybody, right? Starting at the Azure AD Basic EDU piece. So you guys all have access to that. And I know a number of you are using it today because I've talked to you, and it is really a whole lot easier than you would think to publish your on-prem applications through that remote app proxy. And so you can have multiple app proxies set up. So you have, some resiliency there as well. But the really cool thing about it is that means that you get two things. One, Azure AD sits in front of your on-prem apps, even if they're doing their own custom auth or something else, even if they're not pulling from SAML or OAuth before they're taking that token. So you still get all that conditional access and all those pieces, but you also then get the access control reporting. So the access logs in Azure AD are tracking that. So now you start to get more intel inside of Azure AD for stuff like impossible travel scenario, compromised accounts, those types of things.
Yeah, there's a lot of goodness. I mean, we really push a lot of folks to authenticate through Azure if and when possible, whether it's for federated applications or on-prem apps. If we can make that happen, you can get a ton of benefits just by having the authentication flow through Azure Active Directory.
So I just maybe a clarification, Chris and Preston, real quick. So I know Preston said it once, and I think I put it in the chat pane. So you get B2B with any variation, A1, A3, or A5, as it relates to B2B. So if you're on the free version, you can still get B2B. On the paid versions, A3 and A5, you get 5 external B2B access licenses for each paid faculty staff member. Beyond that, when you get A3 and A5, which is the premium versions, you start getting things like MFA and conditional access. Is anybody unclear on that? I just want to make sure, because I saw somebody had made a mention about some announcements with new MFA announcements at Ignite, and I'm not sure if you're talking about there's another piece of MFA, which is Azure MFA, which is completely separate. That's really an Azure run SaaS service, which is completely different from the M365 service as far as this conversation goes. So if you need to clarify that, please feel free if I didn't answer your question for you. All right, I guess we did. Awesome. Any questions? So really cool stuff, Chris. Any other areas that you ever play with outside of this around B2B? I know access, sometimes researchers, I think, is another area that we oftentimes see people or corporate partners, they need specific access to a particular system.
Oh yeah, I mean,
we're
using it as part of merger and acquisition processes to speed it up, right? We'll start them off with B2B accounts and then transition them over. Researchers is a great one because you can give them access into your Azure environment. So if they need access to resources in Azure, they can utilize that B2B account for it. Simple coexistence, right? We want to have shared gals. This is a heck of a lot easier than trying to open up, ports and doing gal sync through MIM or something. There's a ton of use cases for being able to synchronize those together. And we see more and more folks take advantage of it. We got a lot of medical universities that are starting to do shared services for smaller clinics. And so they're using B2B accounts to light that up very quickly and provide access to web applications and shared services without having to manage identities. I think a big use case we're going to see more of, and we're starting to get some traction around, is parent portals. Nobody wants to manage parent accounts, and they need access to resources to pay the bills or check on grades or what have you, depending on whether you're higher ed or K-12. And this is a viable way to do that.
Chris,
Awesome.
This is Rob
So, hey,
Smith again.
thanks. Sorry, you had some more
Oh,
questions, Preston?
I just wanted to ask a quick question. So,
Yes, sir.
what I thought I heard you say when you're setting these B2B accounts up is that you can actually have these people that are external users be members and not guests for resources like Teams.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
You can change, all it is a user type attribute. So all you've got to do is flip that attribute from type guest to user. But there's not a ton of use cases where you really need to do that, because you can give a guest can be a member of a team and can have access to virtually anything in Teams that you'd like to give them access to.
Yeah. Okay.
Back in SharePoint, the whole 9 yards.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Marge? I saw you had a question. Feel free if there's any other questions from the group, please add in. So Marge's question is, I think I'm missing something. So at UT we have 15 AAD probably, and site licenses are A5. So you have some A5, but each campus will have far less paid faculty and staff than 1 to 5 if all the system was added in B2B. So
you can add more licenses. I mean, you can add more accounts than the 5 to 1, but I don't think you can extend the premium services past the 5 to 1 ratio. Does that make sense? So say you had, we'll use simple math, right? You've got 100 paid licenses and you've got 700 B2B accounts. That's valid, but you can't extend MFA as a premium service to 700 folks. You're going to get throttled at 500. It's the way I understand it.
Yeah, so let me see if I can address this specifically to cover margin. I think this will make sense to everybody. So essentially what happens in your case, Marge, every institution has an A5 license. All users, faculty, staff, and students are covered by A5 and have licenses, therefore, for conditional access and MFA and all of those things. So if you were to utilize a tool like the one that Chris has shown here to create all of these guest users, which would exceed 5 to 1 against paid license, all that, it really, in that case, wouldn't impact you, because those users, according to the policies of UT system, are going to have MFA against them in their native Active Directory anyway. What we're really talking about is to say, I have a B2B user account who's coming in and I want to ensure that they're using MFA to come in. And so if they already have their own MFA, like would be the case for all the other UT system accounts, they're going to use their native MFA for that. If they don't have native, then it would use like Azure MFA to enforce that for them. So in your case, you wouldn't have to worry about it for those folks throughout the system who are already all licensed. This would be for sort of folks beyond that.
Yeah, it really comes down to how your licenses are distributed with the partner organizations. If UT had a research partnership with Duke and Duke didn't happen to have those licenses, then you could extend those rights on a 5 to 1 ratio.
Yeah, and this is, since Mark, since you brought it up, this is an interesting one for like UT system and the whole sort of Gaussing conversations and things over time. So it'd be interesting to follow some of that back up. So Chris, you and I will definitely be having a one-on-one conversation after this because that was a tool I hadn't seen from you guys. So I'm interested in it and want to continue to help some of my customers specifically around some of the things with parent portals and whatnot that we've been talking about. So
awesome.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, just hit me up, man. I mean, we're seeing David's been intimately involved. We're doing something very similar for a large statewide system, and we've got a bunch of other use cases for this type of technology. And this just makes it, while you can achieve it with scripts or some other things, those are kind of a pain. This makes it really easy. It runs in the cloud and is really, really quick.
Yeah, that's right. And so that was a question that was just popped into the IM window, which is, what are the other tools? Let's say somebody isn't working with Foresight and the tool that you showed. What are the options that they have to manage guest access at scale?
So at scale, text files or the bulk import, which is kind of unwieldy, you can do it via PowerShell or the Graph API.
So, and I would tell you that I don't think the CSV, it's in preview today. I would not recommend that, certainly.
Yeah, it's not phenomenal.
So I would say today the answer is primarily PowerShell and the Graph API, per what you said. And those can process CSVs, they can process text files and work extremely well. You also, you could use any number of other automation tools that you might have that would interface with either PowerShell or the Graph API, but that's how you would manage that. In fact, for office hours here, when we converted about a year ago over to Teams, or maybe it was longer than, probably about a year ago, that's what we did. We took the registration files and used PowerShell to manage all of that guest access to create those invites and things that went out to all of you. So PowerShell is primarily that answer. If you're looking something that is GUI based, you're going to need a third-party tool like the one that Chris was showing.
Cool, thanks guys. I was thinking actually more in terms of, like account expiration after a while, let's say you want to validate the users are still active or really there. You don't want to muck up your directory, any kind of account validation or cleanup afterwards.
Yeah, we can do that in our tool. Outside of that, you would have to write PowerShell or Graph to go and find that. The upside, once they're linked together, you will still have an object, but they won't be able to authenticate. So you're not exposed from a security standpoint necessarily, but you do have, just bloat in your directory.
And there is a feature in Azure AD, my brain is not coming up with the name of it, Sam or somebody else may have it, that you can go in and validate like guest accounts, go through and check and see if they're still active. I'll have to look for that.
Yeah, I didn't know there was a GUI option. We do it in the Graph and pull last login times and then base it off of that.
Isn't that through access reviews?
Yeah, there you go.
You can set up access reviews, but access reviews is more of an attestation feature where you create a list and someone goes through it. I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, that's not quite the same thing, though. The access reviews would be like you've got a list of 50 people and you go through and validate that they still need access. And then they can be removed based on that validation, but it doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't look at login times or anything.
As far as I understand it doesn't, yeah, and it actually makes it puts it on someone to actually have to go through that, right?
Correct. Yeah. It's like an attestation list, right, where you have to go through and say, hey, these 50 people should still have access. It's not going to be, which has its place, but I don't think that's the same thing you're looking for. That's something that we do, and by connecting back to the directory, we also, whenever they remove their account on their end, so assuming that person leaves the organization, their Azure AD account disappears, we remove the associated B2B account in your directory. But we can also set up some time bombs around it. If they don't use it in 30 days, 60 days, it can be deleted or disabled at that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, even if you're going to use the built-in attestation, you're probably going to go pull those reports. So you might as well look at a way to automate that.
Yep.
All right. We can probably turn off recording.